Okay, we left off at behavioral therapies in our last session. One really important part of behaviorism and why it is so prevalent in programs and places where third-party payers, i.e. insurance companies, pay for people's therapy is that behavioral approaches to treatment can demonstrate objectively with data that people have actually changed and improved. Our other forms of therapy involve self-report, where the individual may say, yes, I feel better, or I'm able to do more. But in behaviorism, data drives the entire program. So they will do charting, lots of baseline. How's the person doing when we meet them? And we collect data. And then after we make an intervention, we collect more data and we show with numbers that the person has really improved. So we do this with designs called ABA or ABAB designs. So A is without treatment, B is implementing treatment, and then A is taking away treatment and seeing if the person's behavior has significantly changed from baseline through treatment to now. Or we often have to do a baseline and then implement treatment and then take away the treatment and see how they're doing, and they're not doing great as long as the treatment's not in effect, so we have to put the treatment back into effect. Okay, so an example of this would be we make a contract for change. So let's say we have somebody who needs to change some of their aggressive behavior. Let's say it's a child in elementary school, first grade, and they need to change their aggressive behavior. So we would chart how often they are aggressive and how aggressive they are. And then we would implement some positive reinforcement when they're not aggressive and some punishment when they are aggressive. And then we would stop that and then observe their behavior again. We would hope that the program of behavior modification that we implemented here would last so that they are permanently changed and they are performing well above baseline where they were too aggressive. If they are not, then we have to implement the behavioral modification again and continue it for a longer period of time, giving them positive reinforcement when they're behaving well and giving them appropriate punishment when they are being aggressive. So we'd make a contract for that change with the kid that would look like, if you discontinue your aggressive behavior or you increase your cooperative behavior, then you are going to earn this kind of reward each hour, each day, each week, and each month. So we would increase the rewards depending on how long the kid has cooperated with our program. So behavior analysis examines the consequences of behavior and modifies them to produce change. Let's go back to that for a second. So you can be a board certified behavior analyst. These professionals are known as BCBAs, and they go into situations kind of like what you see on TV with the nanny or the dog whisperer. They evaluate a situation, look at the consequences of behavior, modify it so that you get new behaviors that last. So this is a designation that you can get with a bachelor's degree in psychology, and most of the people that are BCBAs work with kids who have autism. Now, there's going to be a big demand for these folks because our autism rates are going up astronomically. They now think that 1 in 49 boys has autism, and there's a little bit less of that in girls. Those kids have now become adults, and we have lots of adults that have autism or have an autism spectrum disorder that really can perform certain kinds of jobs, but we need training programs. And I just saw this on the news the other day, where now there are training programs for social skills and for specific jobs that people on the autism spectrum can do. And board certified behavior analysts with BAs in psychology can definitely be involved in those programs, helping people on the autism spectrum have a productive life. So if we were in class, this is an example of what would happen. I would say, okay, everybody get your iClickers ready. And then I would put up this question. Behaviorists primarily focus on, okay, what do you think? You think they primarily focus on how people deal with blocks to their growth? The neurotransmitters? Stimuli, response, and consequence? Or behavioral antecedent? So if we were in class right now, you all would use your clickers and click in the answer that you think is right. And then I would have a blank between, and then I would show you the answer. Stimulus, response, and consequence. And you would celebrate if you got it right, and you would learn the correct answer if you got it wrong. Now, this is interesting because who focuses on how people deal with blocks to their growth? That's right, the humanists. And who focuses on neurotransmitters? That's right, the neuroscience or medical or biological model. Behavioral antecedents is also part of behaviorism, but it's not their primary focus. Okay, let's move on to the sociocultural perspective. We don't talk about this so much in class because it's not a real prevalent theoretical perspective, but it's important for counselors to think about this. The sociocultural perspective thinks the causes of abnormal behavior may be found in the failures of society rather than in the person. That's an interesting idea. The focus is on relationships between mental health and social factors such as gender, social class, ethnicity, and lifestyle. So, failures of society in the area of how we treat each other with respect to gender, social class inequities, ethnicity biases, and lifestyle or socioeconomic status. For example, if your culture believes that mental illness doesn't exist, then no treatment is possible. Change involves adapting to one's culture. So it means that you come to understand what your culture expects of you, and you work toward meeting those expectations so that you can have an adaptive life. Now, I'm not talking about conforming to what everybody thinks and buying the four-door sedan and the little house. I'm not talking about those kinds of things, but adapting to your culture in terms of the way you relate to other people. Some cultures believe that mental illness comes from spiritual conflicts, so the treatment is go to church. And we see that a lot in certain cultures where they say, if you don't feel right, if you're depressed, you have anxiety, it's because you are not right with your God. And you need to go to church and get right with your religion and your God, and then you will feel better. Before I move on. So that's kind of a challenge because some families don't believe in allowing their members to go to counseling. They believe that they should go to church. And some forms of mental illness cannot be treated through religious participation. So many young people whose family believe that either try to sneak to a counselor or go to the doctor but don't tell their parents that they got an antidepressant, or they wait until they're 18 to get treatment. If this happens to be you, believe me, if you're 18, you can go see one of our counselors and your family won't have to know, so you can finally get treatment. Okay, so the sociocultural perspective places importance on social and cultural factors, like we said, ethnicity, gender, and socioeconomic status, sees abnormal behavior as a failure of society rather than the person, and sees abnormal as a label used to stigmatize social deviance. So if someone is doing something that you don't like, You might characterize them as abnormal rather than just choosing to do something that you don't agree with. It's an interesting perspective, but it's not talked a lot about because there's really not a therapy. And if in fact this is true, there's not a lot we can do about it other than do cognitive therapy to help the person cope. So ethnicity and mental health is kind of important to touch on. Exposure to racism and discrimination is a significant source of stress, of course, as you know, among ethnic minorities. And differences among ethnic subgroups in prevalence of psychological disorders does exist. And difference in persistence and chronicity of psychological disorders exists. So this is a significant stressor. We're going to talk about the diathesis stress model of mental illness. And diathesis means what you may have been born with, a given in your family's heritage, in your genes to develop a mental illness, plus stress equals mental illness. And this is certainly a significant stress for many. So there's the social causation model, the belief that social stressors such as poverty account for greater risk of severe psychological disorders among people of lower socioeconomic status. However, you cannot develop schizophrenia or any kind of psychosis just from being poor. You have to have a genetic predisposition to having those disorders, and then the stress of poverty might bring it out. So there's this downward drift hypothesis. I don't talk about it very much, but the theory that explains the linkage between low socioeconomic status and behavior problems by suggesting that problem behaviors lead people to drift downward in social status. Well, that's true, because if you don't feel like going to work, it's hard to keep your job. You don't keep your job, you fall into a lower socioeconomic status. So I think it can go both ways. Either your low socioeconomic status contributes to anxiety and depression, or anxiety and depression can contribute to low socioeconomic status. So what we like to see is an integration of the models. And the most common sense approach is that abnormality results from the interaction of genetic, biological, developmental, emotional, behavior, cognitive, social, and societal influences. So a counselor needs to take all of these elements into account when they have a client sitting across from them. Then some biology, psycho, thinking, social influence theorists also favor the diathesis stress approach. Like I just mentioned, diathesis is your genetic inheritance toward having or not having a mental illness, plus the stressors that you experience in your world equal mental illness. Now here's the thing about this. You might have a diathesis toward having schizophrenia, but your life isn't very stressful, so we don't see the schizophrenia. You might have a diathesis towards schizophrenia, not be very stressed, and we still see the schizophrenia manifest. You might have a diathesis towards schizophrenia and be stressed, and we see mental illness. So it can go a variety of ways. The biopsychosocial model is very prevalent, and it's an integrative model for explaining the abnormalities in terms of the interactions of biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors. So the broad view is that multiple factors can contribute to a mental illness. For example, some phobias may be learned behaviors that are acquired through experiences, yet some people may inherit certain traits that make them susceptible to phobias. A diathesis is that vulnerability or predisposition to a particular disorder. So the diathesis stress model suggests that abnormal behavior arises from the interaction of a vulnerability or predisposition and stressful life events or circumstances. Okay, next time we will talk about the diathesis stress model in a little more detail. See you then.